Ladies and gentlemen, if you can take your seats, get yourselves settled. And good afternoon, I'm Ian, and I'd like to introduce you to Ben Martin. He's going to be talking about the simple SAML.
Yep, SimpleSAML.
SimpleSAML, there you go, if you've only got 20 users. A little bit of background, he's the lead developer of FileSender and the maintainer of the SimpleSAMLphp. Previously, he's created the libferus file system, if that means, and pushed the envelope on what a file system can do. He loves to build robots, CNC machines, we love them, and tinker with electronics. Been there and done that. And long history with open source. So look, please make him welcome. And here's Ben Martin.
Alrighty. Yes, I came on about a year ago as part-time the maintainer of SimpleSAMLphp, mostly to look at people putting pull requests up, and they'd sort of get some attention and then languish for a while. So there needed to be someone on the project who was the maintainer who could sort of look at them and give them attention and say, you know, do you want to fix this, do you want to fix that, test them out and merge them if they were of interest. So I started using SimpleSAMLphp in the context of FileSender, which uses that for user authentication. And in SimpleSAMLphp 1.0 days, I actually misconfigured the system, which seemed to be somewhat popular among users, where I would just directly avoid any of the SAML messaging and go straight to hit the database to authenticate myself. And in this context, it wasn't that bad because, you know, developer or file sender using it on one machine, there's only really one or two users in the SAML database, and it's only really going to be accessed by me anyway. So it seemed like one of those, the quickest way I could configure it to actually get it to authenticate me was the way I was going to be going. So SAML is an assertion markup language. So basically it is about saying you are who you claim to be. And it's all XML based, and there's signatures and there's encryption. It allows federated login, so you can log into multiple identity providers, and has single sign-on and single sign-off, which does actually work in the value of single equals one, rather than some government things in Australia where if you single log off, it says you may still be signed on elsewhere. A lot of places use SSP, and typical deployments, you've got 100,000 users, and this is the documentation of SSP is tailored sort of toward this, if you like. They assume that you're knowing what SAML is, they're assuming you know what this particular server is, you want to run 2 or 3 different servers, have them all high availability proxied, and you sort of come in and you say, how do I configure this to do that? I already know what I'm doing. Whereas there's a number of people like me who are wanting to just use the library and wanting to not have to do all of the, you know, you can look at that later on if you like, but you want to just get up and running. And that's the purpose of this talk. So that basically is how to use SimpleSAMLphp, and this is even more complicated than it needs to be. So you include the PHP header, you tell it what service you are, which is typically your application. You're developing a, you know, mymail.app or something like that, some way to identify you from other potential users of the library. And when you need to have a page that has authentication, you just say you require auth. You don't actually need to pass the return to URL. That's completely optional. You can either pass that in, you can set that in the config file, or it will actually redirect back to your app once it's done. So that didn't need to be there, and the get attributes didn't need to be there. It's basically 3 lines, and you're using SimpleSAMLphp. And from there, it can scale from a SQLite database on your local server, authenticating your users, right up to, you know, if you want to deploy on a national research group with 200,000 users, that particular code doesn't need to change. So that's the advantage and the ease of it, I suppose, if you've got SimpleSAML installed and set up. And that was the hard part. The actual use of the library is very easy and very robust, and it's easier to do than writing your own thing. If you had to create a page with username and password, and then you had to use PHP's password hash, and then you had to compare it to the database, there's a lot more work trying to actually even spin something up yourself than what that is. So the workflow inside, I should also mention at this stage that I have SSP small, which basically has 4 scripts that you can run, and that will download and install and configure everything that I'm talking about here, so you can run that. You can then directly use an SQLite database, or if you're using your own database already, you can have SSP small use your database, and that's basically all you would need to do for having a configuration using SimpleSAMLphp. Because this is a Linux conference, I will also go into all of the details and nitty-gritty, low level, but keep in mind the whole time that basically that one page with 3 lines, run 3 scripts. If you have a database where you can store password hashes, you're pretty much, you're done at that point. From SimpleSAMLphp's point of view, the whole thing's based on browser redirection. So in this case, and the browser redirection, there we go, the require auth will actually redirect the browser off to the SimpleSAML install. And it does the authentication, and the wheels all turn, and if it's successful, it comes back to your app. And it comes back to your app, and the get attributes will say, yes, they are authenticated. You can check whether they are or not and reject it. And redirection needs to happen because there are browser cookies. So when you have, I'll get to that point at some stage, but the workflow is your app, the SP is your app name or my app in that previous thing, and then there's an IDP or identity provider, which typically like at a university level, you'll log in and you'll have your email address and password, and the IDP will be, you know, QUT or UQ or something like that, and they will have that information and they can verify that you've got the right password. And the passwords and everything are stored in the authentication method. And then at that point, once you've reached that level in the stack, if you've actually given the right password or you've presented the right 2-factor authentication, it all redirects back to your app and it says, yep, here's a positive assertion that Ben is who he says he is. I know that's the case. Here's some extra attributes about Ben. He's, you know, over 18, so if you want to know that, it's there, or whatever the IDP wants to say about me. SSP Small is a project that I spun up maybe 2 or 3 months ago, basically for installing configurations, downloads, installs, SimpleSAMLphp, sets things up on the localhost SSP Small directory and sets up a local SQLite database. So if you're looking to play around with all of this, you run the 4 scripts. In part of the script, which I'll be going over, it creates a small collection of users so that you have someone to log in as right off the bat. And to keep it sort of fairly lightweight, it by default uses SQLite, but you can change that to MariaDB or Postgres or, you know, whatever relational database you're looking for. Or you can actually change the back end and say, I've got an LDAP server, I've got a WS Fed, I've got ADFS, which is the same sort of thing. But, you know, you can say, I don't particularly want that. I want to actually authenticate all my users against, you know, Google or Facebook or whatever, and have SimpleSAMLphp go and do that for you. In this case, obviously, you're using the social networking side as the identity provider, so that, you know, if you can log into that particular service, then they're saying that you are who you claim to be. The SQLite side, it's a fairly basic setup. Users and the password hash is stored in there. There's another version which uses the database itself to do password hashing, but I figured PHP is being used anyway, so we might as well just use password hash and password verify in PHP, and that creates very minimum sort of requirements on the relational database. All you're doing is saying, here are 2 strings, shove them somewhere, and in this particular case, you can have any other information in your database. If you've got an existing database of users, you just add a password hash column, call it whatever you like. You can configure that in the system to be something other than password hash, thus the password hash column, and the query to actually look up a user, look up their password hash based on their username. So you can use usernames as being email addresses. A lot of systems do that, and there's also another standard where you, instead of using proper email addresses, you use something that looks a lot like an email address but isn't, and that way you can change your real email address to whatever you like, but this other identifier is meant to be following you around as your identifier sort of forever, if you like. So you can change email providers, but the thing that looks like an email address is going to stay the same because it may not actually be an email address. There's 4 different scripts. 2 are set up in a sync, and some of them require root privileges, mainly to set up permissions and things like that on your system. It's split into two so that you can run the setup once and the sync. If you're playing around with the config files or something like that, you want to change something, you can modify the config file that comes in SSP small and just keep running sync. So if you want to debug things or you want to play around with how your authentication's working, you can run sync multiple times and sync as root to actually set the permissions so that everything works on your machine. I had been asked why I've got the 4 scripts rather than just using Docker or some other container format, and they don't really compete. Like if you want to run a Docker file and use the 4 scripts and create a container, that's all perfectly fine. Mainly I started out this way because it's just fairly lightweight. Like you don't need to run a container thing or anything like that just to have this installed. And the whole idea of SSP small was that you have, a machine that might just be a Raspberry Pi and you don't really want to throw containers around. You just want to be able to use the library. So the setup is root script, copies an Apache config over so that it can find that thing, sets up permissions and things like this. The Symfony cache needs to be a read-write directory because SimpleSAMLphp uses Symfony and Twig for the Twig to actually present the UI to you so that there's less potential template injections and things like that. And because it's only meant to be run once, you can restart Apache, which you don't, well, maybe not necessarily need to do. There's 2 different distributions of SimpleSAMLphp, so it downloads the full archive, which includes a small collection of modules. The website is potentially like a little bit less upfront about what the difference between the minimal and the full one is, but that is actually the difference between them. Disco Power has got nothing to do with John Travolta. It's more for discovery. So if you have multiple identity providers and things, you can discover them, but it gets brought back to Disco for some reason. And the SQL auth module and the LDAP. So the SQL auth module is what is used in SSP small to actually authenticate you with SQL. So that comes in as part of the full archive. I would recommend, if you're looking at playing around with things and you're looking to actually expose this to potentially someone who might want to attack your system, having a look at the module, the rate limit module. So that way you can look at people who are trying to attack and use guessing passwords or having the fixed password and trying to guess email addresses and just trying to basically break into the system in ways that aren't sort of things like limiting by IP address, which if there's NAT going on, then you're building a denial of service attack for someone to use against you if you do that. The sync script, which can be run, this is probably the core to the whole scripting thing, copies the config, sets up SSL certificates, changes your admin password, which you'll obviously want to look at that script and change again so that you're not using the default admin password. And there's part in that script to recreate that SQLite application database, which you may or may not want to use, but it's there by default. So that you've got 3 users that you can log in, so you can just run the scripts, try and log in with one of those 3 users and see if it all happens. And the sync as root does very little, just basically make sure the permissions are okay. The configuration of SimpleSAMLphp, there's mainly 5 config files. So the config/config is the main config file. The application or service providers and your authentication methods go in the auth sources. So authentication methods are things like, I've got this LDAP server over here. You can contact that with usernames and passwords, and if that comes back okay, we'll treat that as being okay for this identity provider. And the service provider, so your app name, my app, would actually be in this authsources.php as well. And then you have a bunch of metadata because this is meant to be sort of installed on a large sort of scale. Normally your app or service provider thing is on one machine. The identity provider would be on one or more other machines. Like you might say, okay, QUT is my identity provider, or this university is doing that for me. And then they have their own server, and then they'll probably have their own LDAP server or database server. So it's sort of condensing 3 or 4 servers that are normally there onto one directory here. So the IDP has a hosted and remote, and then it'll have certificates to talk from the IDP that's hosted to an IDP remote, which is meant to be a different machine, and they'll need to actually authenticate with these certificates to make sure that it's legitimately that same identity provider. But you need to have the configuration file set up for a service provider or remote to actually talk there, and also provide, well, those configuration files will be gone over in a moment. The auth sources for your SP, basically in this case, you can either set the identity provider to null, or you can explicitly say a URI for your IDP, which I do in this case. There is only one identity provider at the moment in SSP small, but you can configure it for up to 6 SPs. So in that case, it's useful if you want to play around with single logout, so you can have 2 different apps and log into one app, log into the second app, log out from one, and then go back to the first app and see whether it thinks you logged in or not, which it should in this case. If you log out from one, you log out from both. And the SP remote is basically defining these locations for SimpleSAML to know how to actually do that. So when you log out, it will call these endpoints and say, okay, you've done a logout from a particular service provider for an identity provider. So you're saying for SSP small being your identity provider, you're logging out, and then it will call out each of these apps and say, yep, you're logged out on, you've now logged out. And without these endpoints, if you log out from one app, you've logged out from that one app. But if you have these endpoints in place, then it will call them and everything will know that you have actually logged out. So you get proper single logout. The IDP hosted, you're basically saying, yep, I'm an identity provider, these are my keys to identify me, so that nobody else can say I am the identity provider, you know, unless they've broken in and stolen your SSL keys. And you want a particular, from there, the identity provider, when it's asked, you know, please identify Ben, it will say, okay, I'll be using, my auth will be SQL, so I'll use the SQL module to go and say, okay, what's your password? I'm going to check that on the file and see whether you've got the right password or not. And the IDP remote, because again these are usually meant to be multiple servers, says, okay, I'm on the service thing, I'm on my app, how do I contact the identity provider for this? And so it says, here's the actual copy of the keys for them. And also for single sign-on stuff, so there's keys generated to actually talk to yourself with SSP small. That's the same server. But because of the machinery is there, you need to actually have these keys there, and that's why the setup script generates these keys and puts them in place. So again, like the use of SimpleSAMLphp is 3 lines, but unless you had this, the actual setting up of SimpleSAMLphp is quite a learning process. Like there's a lot of, you know, you can do it if you're keen, but you need to sort of sit there and think, oh, where do I put these keys? Where do I put these 3 metadata files? Why isn't it talking? Oh, and then logs are doing this. Whereas in this case, all of this is sort of the baseline. You run the 4 scripts, these are all installed. It's interesting to see these scripts and where they are and what they're doing, because you may then turn around and say, okay, I'd like to have a second identity provider, I want to change it to doing this. And the auth source, this is very familiar because this is what we were seeing earlier with here is the SQLite database. Here's how I'm going to get those password hash things back to do a password verify. And then on top of that, if you wanted to test it out, I've also created SSP small app, which is just a very trivial sort of PHP app. I mainly created this so I could have multiple instances of this. You could have 6 different SSP small apps installed, and then you can just go to 1, 2, 3 in different tabs, log in, check that you've logged in the other tabs, because when you single log in, you go to app 1, you do a login, you go to app 2 and it'll say, okay, would you like to log in? And you click on login and it says, yeah, you've already logged in app 1. I know your identity, so now you're logged in here. It won't ask you for your username and password a second time. And you can go to the third one and then log in straight away. So then you've got 3 apps that are there in different tabs, and if you go and click log off on one of them, the other 2 will get notified with these links that were there before, and then you go back to one of the other SSP small apps and say, am I logged in? Like refresh the page, and it'll say, no, you're not logged in anymore. You've done a single log off from some other app. And this is another advantage to using this setup as opposed to just saying, okay, I'm going to have my own SQLite database, I'm going to handle a page that asks for username and password, in that basically if you have your app and then you turn around and say, I'd like to have file sender as well. If you've logged into your app, you can set it so that file sender will automatically log you in. And then if you have another app that's using SimpleSAMLphp, you can automatically log in the 3rd and 4th and 5th app. And these apps all don't need to be on your machine. They can be someone else. You know, one of your mates is running that, brings up the laptop, and they can log you in on your SSP small. So your authentication becomes a lot less of a burden because it's all running one central server. Perhaps I should have put that in the sell the whole talk thing at the start. Although it's probably not too bad to break that up so that people sort of get little tidbits of interesting information as we go through. The code for the SSB small app is basically very similar to what we've seen before. We include the library, we make a symbol thing with the name of the app that we're doing, which in this case is $SP, so we can have predefined up to 6 different versions of the app installed. And exactly the same thing, you just require authentication on the login page. On the logout page, you just call the logout function, and there should be an info page which asks, are we authenticated? So you can actually have a page that degenerates. If you're not authenticated, then just don't show this particular table of information. Still show the menus and things like that. So inside that block, that's privileged stuff that you need to be authenticated for. And that's more or less what the app looks like. If I've authenticated, that's one of the default logins, which I think has some easily guessable password. And my ID there, I'm the 3rd user that I've logged in as, and you can also have other attributes. So SimpleSAMLphp can then, as I was saying, it can return a whole collection of attributes about the person. Whether or not you're wanting to do that, some universities may divulge information like, whether you're enrolled in something, or that can be part of the identity if they feel to do that. There's an admin interface in SimpleSAMLphp, so this is the default page. Lets you see what modules have been enabled, what version you're running. This was the aforementioned admin password that gets set to something that's nice and, well, not easy to guess. It's directly right in the script, so you know what the password's going to be. And you also know how to change it because you can see in the script where it's being set. You can see in this case I have 2 different SPs running and 1 IDP. So you can see what entities, if you like, that particular configuration has read from all of these metadata files and things, and you can see, does that match what I'm thinking it's going to have? And then get the metadata for that, and here even more metadata about some of those files that we're having links for single login and things like that. You can see where it's picked those up from. If you didn't actually specify those, what it's generated, so where it's thinking of finding the single login, single logout endpoints. The test page, if you have admin rights, the test page is quite golden because you can see any authentication source, which you can go, in this case, as either of the service providers, or directly hit an authentication method, so you can go directly against SQL and not as a service provider. But you can run through scenarios and say, if I'm going to log in and I think I'm going to log in as this particular application with a username and password, what's going to become of me? And when you click on that, it'll bring up an interface which, again, is able to be localized in many different languages. And in this case, since it's just a simple username password, like it's not saying, I'm going to send you a 2-factor, or I'm going to ask you to click on a YubiKey or things like that, which is all quite possible to do in modules. Like once you've got this thing going, you can sort of, add more depth to what you're doing. But in this case, I just said, okay, and I'm suspecting the password is something like hello with 5 characters. So, put in my username, put in the password, and either click the login and get a fail prompt, or click the login and it'll bounce me back here and say, that's my user ID, anything other information that's coming back. And this page is very useful too if you've got an identity provider that you're not running, because you could have your own service provider and then say, I'd like to use some social network to identify the person. And then you can see in the bottom part, or your attributes, you can see what they're actually returning. So they may return information that you weren't expecting to see. So you'll be able to see everything that's coming back from that IDP or that authentication session, which may be useful to your application. Then you can say, okay, they've got a special attribute that says, this person's doing this or that, or they are enrolled, or they graduated on this date, whatever strange things they may include in the identity thing. Well, they may just say, okay, they've got this email or this ID, and they've definitely authenticated somehow with a password that we're happy with, and you're happy to trust that, which is the core of the whole thing. Before I get into the tracing, one of the interesting parts there is how the actual users get set up, and setting up or provisioning users and changing users' passwords is sort of outside of the scope of SimpleSAML. Like SAML doesn't seem to want to get in on that sort of thing, so that's one of the scripts that was setting up the SQLite database was actually creating a whole bunch of users and setting their passwords. And you'll need to come up with some way in your app or some way to say, okay, I've got 20 people, I'm going to start those 20 people, I'm going to generate a password and give them to the 20 people somehow out of band. And there's no way for in the standard interface, there are scripts like for the LDAP backend and things like that to change a user's password, but there's no way in there to say, okay, I've logged in. There's no standard way in the SimpleSAMLphp to say I'd like to change my password. So in that case, you'll need to sort of have some way of, basically asking for their password, doing a password hash and putting it back into the SQLite database. So that page, if you're wanting to allow users to change their password, is sort of out of the scope of it. There's a SAML trace, which is a browser extension. Yes, the header was wrong, but this is a browser extension and it doesn't send any of the information over to any third-party site. It doesn't leave your browser. But if you go through a SAML authentication session, which doesn't have to necessarily be for SimpleSAMLphp or for SSP Small, if you went somewhere else that was using it, like to your university or to your workplace, assuming that they're quite happy with you doing this, you can pick off the XML messages from the wire and see and debug what actually is happening and get right into the details and read the specifications of SAML and see what the attributes are. Or in this case, if you click on the summary tab, you can see in this case, I think in the other one it was, auth end request. So I'm asking for authentication for this particular user, and it comes back on the other side with a response as to what's happened there. And further down in the page, what signature was used for that XML, and what method, all of the details are there, and you can you could actually take that to something that wasn't SimpleSAMLphp if you wanted to parse the XML and you wanted to verify all of the signatures and you wanted to do all of that yourself, if you were that way inclined. Or if something's broken, the SimpleSAML tracer is very handy to be able to see, is it requesting the wrong URL? Are wrong URLs included in this metadata that's sort of bouncing around? And again, you can sort of click on the summary to see interesting stuff of interest, and including the certificates that are used to guarantee that these things are, or to protect that it's coming from a source that you're trusting, if you like. SimpleSAMLphp has a whole bunch of modules. So the admin module that we saw was one of those modules. The rate limit that I was mentioning, you can do YubiKey stuff. The ADFS, so if you wanted to connect with a Microsoft network and use their username and password thing, if there was a reason wanting to do that, you can do that with modules. You can also do the FIDO stuff, which I haven't played around with, but if you're wanting to do that with SimpleSAML, you can sort of talk to a lot of other authentication schemes. So the main takeaways from the talk are that the simple API is that you need to include the library, you need to give your application a name, and you basically say, authenticate me. 3 lines, and you can use SimpleSAMLphp, assuming that you have all of these config files set up, you have all the certificates set up, you have a username, password database in the background, or an LDAP server. If you've got all of that, and you're just a PHP programmer who wants to authenticate someone, then 3 lines of code. So it is quite easy, and that's why SSP Small is there, so that you can sort of condense what would normally be multiple servers down just into, here's one directory, here's one SQLite database that I'm wanting to use to authenticate people. I'd like to sort of start small, and later on I can expand out and say, okay, now I want to actually use a Postgres database, or I want to authenticate with Radius, or I want to actually deploy this, for a large amount of users. If you're wanting to do that and move to a large amount of users, then basically you don't have to change your app at all. Those 3 lines should be okay to be staying where they are. Maybe If I go off to some NREN and say I'd like to run this there, they may say, okay, please change your SP name to being whatever we're calling your application, and then so you just change one string in one call and you're done. And you get the pleasure of having single sign-on, so if you've got 5 apps and you log in once with your username and password, you don't have to sit there typing in username and password when you move to app B or app C, or you install FileSender and you want to log in, you don't have to log in again, you just click login, it says okay, you've already authenticated, that session hasn't expired, I will say you are who you are because you're using the same browser. I'll accept your identity provider, I'll accept that you are the person claiming you are. I've made slight changes. There's a pull request at the moment to have an SP hosted, so that the service provider stuff is all sort of in that one metadata chain rather than mixing service providers and authentication methods in one config file. Auth procs are fun as well, auth procedures. So if you have an identity provider who comes back, you can then say, this attribute that you have here is slightly different to what I want to have in my app. And then auth proc can copy an attribute, rename an attribute, delete an attribute, basically auth procedure. So you're just running a whole bunch of code, you set up however many you like in a chain, and it just keeps running those over, and you sort of massage the metadata before it gets sent back to the client again. And this is useful as well if you have a different authentication method in the background, like an LDAP server, maybe returning attributes in a format that you're not expecting. And if you can transpose those from one format to another, that's a good place to be able to be doing that. And there's probably, if you're using standard things, there's probably a standard configuration for that auth proc floating around already. And I think I'm slightly ahead of time, quite a bit ahead of time actually. Yes. So I think, questions, I suppose.
Questions? Are we there? Oh, wonderful. Any questions, anybody? Put your hand up. Questions down the back. Please state your question.
I saw the OpenID Connect module in your plugins or modules list.
Yep.
What is the relationship there? Is it used as an authentication backend?
I would say in the OpenID stuff, I haven't actually played around with that as much, so anything I'm sort of putting out there is going to be a guess at this stage. I was sort of looking over the large list of modules for it, and I thought, yeah, OpenID, that'd be handy.
This library is very heavily used and relied on. I've worked with at least 2 or 3 companies and organizations that rely on it. So thank you for your work. Do you, through your work on the library, ever get requests to do consulting or help on authentication or SAML?
I haven't as such. Okay, I sort of, I know various, well, one of the people on the board have a consultancy firm that do that sort of work, so they would be, you know, I'm sort of more of a look at the PRs, monitor things.
See. Gotcha.
I could certainly, there's a lot of people around there who would help if you have an issue that needs solving.
Yeah, I see.
Any more takers? I think you're on a winner. Could you please inform thank you to Ben for his presentation? A little gift for you, thank you very much, as a token of appreciation from the Everything Open people.
Mm-hmm.
This is the skyline of Adelaide, here's the cathedrals. This has been made by Stuart, one of our core team volunteers, and we're very proud to share them around.
Lovely.
As a recognition, and thanks again.